we'll do the live thing first. Like, hey everybody, welcome back to the Bigmark podcast. It's me, your host, Bigmark. If it's your first time watching, welcome. If not, welcome back. Like I always say, if you ever wanted to reach out to the podcast, hit us up on our Twitter or our X or Instagram at the Bigmark Pod or at the Bigmark Podcast. Check us out there. If you want to hit us up if you wanted to listen to an episode, if you wanted to hear a specific topic, if you wanted to come on as a guest, please reach out. If you ever want to support the podcast, please tell your friends. Like and subscribe to the video, subscribe to our channel on YouTube, and check out our Patreon. There's a couple ways to support that way too. But again, thank you so much for joining us. I'm excited to talk about this book today. It's one of the classic Joe Rogan reading lists, Joe Rogan Book Club unofficial books that always seems to come up with his guests and Joe himself. I just finished listening to it on audiobook through Spotify, and I think I only had to take one break in it with the old classic Spotify listening limit, I should say. I think I made it through somehow. I guess I started at the right time. Maybe that's the best way to do it, is you start it halfway through the month, and then if you only get so much time in, then it rolls over. I don't know how it works yet. I'm still trying to figure it out, and you'll be the first to know, trust me. It's written by S.C. Gwynne. He wrote a couple other great books. Empire of the Summer Moon, which is the book we're going to be talking about today, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Pulitzer? Anyway. But his other a couple of his books, he's written many, but some notable ones was Rebel Yell about Stonewall Jackson and Hymns of the Republic about the entire Civil War. History's always interesting. No matter what lens you look back through, it's really difficult to not look back through your own lens, through your own mindset of the time that you're in. You can't help but put yourself in those shoes, and the only perspective you have is your modern perspective. And it's always hard to say, because some of the accounts in this are pretty brutal and pretty vicious. I won't be able to go into detail into all of them today, but again, there's some kind of brutal things that you don't always necessarily think about when you think about Native American tribes. You think about, of course, the atrocities done by the Europeans, I should say, but, there was a lot of war between tribes as well, and a lot of viciousness and torture and brutality, between all these tribes, because they were all fighting for land and fighting for different places. And, generally speaking, the people that made up all these tribes all migrated from Asia over the Bering Land Bridge. Once, I guess, the short-faced bear was extinct, and there used to be this gigantic bear that used to roam the Bering Land Bridge, or land mass, whatever you want to call it. And they think that actually had a lot to do with why human beings didn't actually migrate over to North America sooner, because this giant bear was there and was like eating humans, basically. But yeah, as that happened, when that did happen, they're thinking about 10,000 years ago or so is where they place it, but it's hard to say sometimes. The people that then became all these tribes migrated over from Asia and lived in the mountains, of course, kind of moved their way through Canada and the Northwest down south and east is kind of the migration pattern, right? Of course, the eastern tribes, the Iroquois, Algonquin, we're a little bit more familiar with, at least here in Canada. Ojibwe, and there's many other tribes that are here in Canada that we that we're more familiar with, but where the Comanche were on the Great Plains. They shared that same area with the Sioux, the Pawnee, the Arapaho, the Cheyenne, and Comancheria. So the Comanches specific area was basically northwest Texas to like eastern New Mexico to Kansas, Oklahoma area, panhandle action. So, and all those different names were just what the tribes referred to as themselves, like as the people. So Sioux, Arapaho, Comanche, whatever, they just meant the people. That they just meant like themselves. That's what they called themselves. And as these people were kind of migrating, and as years went by, and there were some changes in stature and things like that, or just like the different people that moved out here and spread out through the U.S. There was some notable physical differences between the tribes too, and again, the more eastern woodland tribes, we kind of picture these like long and sinuous like kind of avatar people, but the Comanche were kind of small and compact, and they were squeaks. Comanches were squeaks, as we say, and unfortunately, for years and years, they weren't really considered like one of the top, one of the most loved tribes, one of the best tribes. Hard to say good and bad in this scenario, but they were picked on at least by a lot of other tribes. They were always being raided because of their small stature. They weren't necessarily amazing runners or anything like that. They had to hunt buffalo. That's how they ate. But they weren't necessarily amazing at it. There's all these different things. There was a high male death rate just because there was infighting and they were always being attacked from these other tribes. And, most of the times when tribes were raiding, they'd also like steal people and obviously torture and kill and do all these things. And that was the weird thing about these tribal wars, was that there was kind of this, like, I don't know how to necessarily put it, but almost like this arms race of torture. Like if you attacked my village and grabbed someone and tortured them, like, you fucking scalped them and you plucked at their eyes or something. When I then attack your village, which is inevitably going to happen because that was just life on the plains, I'm going to have to torture someone in your family, in your camp, in your village. I'm going to have to torture them like worse. I'm going to do the eyes and something else, right? Like I'm going to cut him. I'm going to take his dick off or something, because that's what was happening. They were mutilating, cutting dicks. They were like, even in the Civil War, during some of those battles where there was Native American tribes involved, like I think Custer died in one and was killed by Native Americans, and they like shoved a rod up his dick and scalped him and did all this craziness. So like there was weirdness, and like they would sometimes kill like a member of your village right in front of you and then like eat part of his liver. Like there wasn't a lot of cannibalism other than that, but they would like eat a part of it. It would just be like really weird. Gang rape, lots of like craziness, like heavy duty, awful. People are getting dragged. Babies have like, just like, the book is pretty kind of gruesome sometimes, I have to admit. But again, this is not your picturesque life, because the plains, the Great Plains of America, especially in these times, 1700s, late 1700s, early 1800s, this was still completely unsettled land. And when you were coming out of, the woods of the East and, moving your way west, in some places, if you go south and you go, as you're like going through Virginia or places like that, you're kind of coming out of a dense forest, and literally as soon as it clears, it's just endless plain. And like, if you're like an early settler, you have no idea what the fuck's going on. Like you're not equipped to deal with what's going out there. Maybe you were able to deal with like living in a forest where there's like different it's different way of living. I mean, there was definitely tribes and Native Americans in there, but you can stay separated a little bit more. There's a little bit more resource in these woods, and there's more things to hunt. But the buffalo were out there in the plains, and there was, I mean, to the natives, the way that they would do it, because they would kill these buffalo and use every single part of them, there was no way that they could kill all these herds of buffalo that existed. But we'll get into it later. But once the settlers came along, they started killing off all these buffalo herds. Things started getting really greasy, really fast. They didn't have any agriculture, like I mentioned. They lived off these buffalo herds, these buffaloes. I read a book called Guns, Germs, and Steel, and essentially the way it worked out, if you look at it this way, Europe and and Eastern Asia were working agriculture about 4,000 years before Native Americans ever got to it, which was basically when the Europeans reintroduced it to them. So they weren't doing agriculture. There was hunter-gatherer still. They were basically in the Stone Age. The men would hunt and the women would cook and prepare the buffalo and dress it and deal with its like hide and all these shits. And polygamy was really popular because the more wives you had, the more labor you had. Now again, even with all these things going on, the Comanches still weren't doing well until the Spanish brought horses, which was in 1519. But once they made their way up into Comancheria and the different areas, different tribes kind of dealt with them. Some tribes didn't want to have anything to do with them. They didn't know how to tame them. Some tribes actually domesticated them and ate them. They were using them. They're just like, oh, this tastes pretty good. But the Comanche learned how to tame them and ride them. They actually ended up basing like their wealth was based off how many horses they actually owned. And they had about 100 years of dealing with these horses and learning how to ride horses before they even saw any settlers come through. So they were like learning how to ride and learning how to tame these horses kind of over a couple generations. And the way that they would tame the horses was really interesting. They would be already on a horse, so who's to say how they ever tamed the first one? But they'd get up on their horse, they'd ride up alongside a wild stallion, whatever, Mustang, I don't know, and lasso their feet, knock them down, or not trip them up. They'd lasso around their neck, and they'd fucking pull that so tight that the horse would start to choke. And as the horse started to choke and fall down and like couldn't breathe, and right at the moment before it was like kind of about to pass out, they'd loose up the lasso and it would come back and it would be all fucking shaky and tripping. And then they would stroke its nose and then its ears and then like its forehead, and they would take its nostril and like cup it and put their mouth on it and blow into the horse's nose. And then the horse would just be like kind of like magically theirs. It was just like they were like these, like there was some kind of kinship with these horses that the Comanche had, and they could ride them. Like they were considered some of the best horsemen in the history of the world. Like they were tremendous. They could they figured out ways to ride like in different patterns as groups, as they were warring parties were out. They were able to, using leg strength, kind of like hang off the side of the horse and shoot from under the chest of the horse. So they could like wrap themselves around, protect most of their body behind the horse, and then shoot their arrows from underneath the horse. So they were very, very, very formidable. And meanwhile, all this is happening. The American government was slowly stealing all this Native American land through, Manifest Destiny and all these different things, as the people started coming through the plains, they were called Taibos, and Taibo in the Native American dialect means list checker. So essentially people in Washington, were kind of just like divvying up all this land on a map and kind of sending people out and saying, all right, yep, this is yours. This is part of America and we own this part. And, you're going to have to kind of make this deal work with the people who live out there right now, even though they didn't want to have anything to do with them, of course. And of course, as all this was happening, ever since the Europeans landed in North America, some tribes were conciliatory, for numerous reasons. Some had to because they were, their people were being killed with illness or violence, and they just wanted it to stop, and they just said, let's do it. Some tribes kind of saw maybe the advantage of seeing these, Europeans come in, and, maybe they could help and have a symbiotic relationship. That was few and far between. Some were neutral and tried to establish peaceful treaties and kind of work together in that sense where it's like, all right, you're over here, I'm over here, let's just be that way. And then some, of course, fought back, and the Comanche, surprise, surprise, fought back. And due to this horse prowess, they were really, really hard to get by. So like their land went untouched for quite some time. They were rarely, if ever, defeated because essentially average Comanche rider could loose about 30 arrows from a full gallop in 1 minute. So as they're riding, they're basically popping out an arrow every 2 seconds. And the early settlers that were coming there with their like musket guns, basically, could only shoot about one bullet in that same time. So this eventually led to the invention of the Colt multi-shot pistol. And that was really the only way that that anybody could ever do it. And like, Texas Rangers were formed, and there was all these kind of marauding white people too that were kind of trying to take all this back. And then they learned all these fighting techniques from the Comanche, and kind of as their land was kind of encroaching around them, these people would, go on their own raiding parties and steal their horses and do all these things too, right? So again, there was a lot of warring between the white settlers and the natives, which is really troubling. But during this time, as the settlers were coming in and the tribes were raiding, when numbers were down, like I mentioned before, in the tribes, they would actually kidnap young children on their raids. So on their raids, they normally killed like the babies, like that would have to be like nursed and like taken care of. They just smashed them on rocks, which is fucked up or whatever. And then they'd rape the women and usually kill them, and then kill all the men and scalp them and shit. But then they'd actually steal like young children. Like, I don't know exactly the age that they cut off shit, but I'm talking like 5 to 10. They would just like basically adopt them and be like, all right, you're learning our ways. Like, you're obviously made at this age. You're probably going to be okay. We can still teach you. You're not like, you're still malleable as a person. Maybe they had some sense of that. And one of the most notable people, which Empire of the Summer Moon more or less is one of the crux of the story. I mean, there's the one half of the story, which is basically all this history between Native Americans and the American government. And then this other half of the story, which does a great job of actually showing a lot, and this is how there's so much insight on Comanche life, is actually through Cynthia Ann Parker, who had journals with all this information. And she was actually a white American settler that was captured and adopted by the Comanches at about age 9. So this is 1836. She was about 9, and she like fully adopted their ways. She fully kind of became Comanche. She learned to speak their language. She actually forgot English. She actually forgot like her white ways, more or less. She was pregnant at the time of her capture. No, that couldn't be because she was 9. I don't know, man. There was something like that in the book. Greasy. Maybe not. Maybe I'm reading it wrong. Maybe they were talking about another girl. Let's just hope. But obviously, as she aged, she did have a few children. Some were killed in front of her. And some she did keep and was able to raise up. She basically like got herself into some like fights with like some of the women that were like some of the other Native women, and like won the fights more or less, and it like really upped her status. And it was kind of like she was kind of trying to get killed. Like she was getting in these fights thinking that they're just going to kill her for like beating this woman, but it kind of like gave her like, they kind of respected it even more, which is hilarious. Well, not hilarious, but kind of the ironic or the opposite of what you'd think or what she hoped. But again, she like fully accepted their ways. She had a daughter, Prairie Flower, and one of her sons, Quanah. I don't know how many kids she ended up having. Shoot. Anyway, one of her sons, Quanah Parker, actually went on to become like the main chief of the Comanches, which is pretty wild. The saddest part is she actually had to see two of her families kind of destroyed in front of her. So the first time on the raid where she was captured, her aunt was like gang raped in front of her and killed, and just like awful shit. So she obviously was like fucked up from that and like lost her whole white family. But then by the time she was, fully ingrained in this Comanche, in this Comanche village, with this tribal band, a bunch of Texas Rangers came and found her, years later, and was like, oh, look, this one has blue eyes, because she had like these like, really light blue eyes. And she was captured again and kind of brought back to civilization, if you will, and like shown off as like, the white squaw. And she was kind of shown off as this like circus act a little bit, which is a little bit sad. But and she was always trying to escape, and like, it was sad because she was taken from her children again, and taken from all her family, and twice she had to endure. She had to endure being ripped from her family, which is awful. And again, it's interesting and it's sad, and people look at this life as like a savage thing, but what is savagery? What is civilization? America was slowly but surely encroaching on all this native land, just taking it away from these people and replacing it with reservations on terrible, unarable land, forced them to live off rations that were inadequate, and they were still, under this guise of freeing them and showing them, this is the way that, you can, life is better this way. And, it's kind of like there's this analogy that Quanah Parker gave once. He asked, how do the Native Americans feel? How do your people feel about losing this land? And how did it happen? And Quanah and him went over, were walking out on a trail and saw a log on the road, on the side of the trail, laying on its side. He said, let's sit down on the log here. And he said, actually, can you move down a little bit? And as his friend moved down, Quanah moved down with him. He said, a little bit more. And he moved down with him. Keep going. Can you scooch down? And he kept going until his friend fell off the log. And Quanah goes, that's exactly how we lost our land. We just tried to keep giving it a little bit and saying, okay, let's not kill each other. Let's not make each other sick. Slowly but surely, they just lost everything. And through trickery, too, of course, on the European side, and just not understanding. But again, there was this, you can't say it was noble, but it was, it was this idea that the Europeans thought what they had was better. And again, like I said, they had a 4,000-year lead on what was going on over in North America. If they're basically in the fucking Stone Age, there was a reason, and that's somewhere still in our DNA, in the Europeans' DNA at least, there's somewhere still in that DNA saying, hey, things can be better. We can keep making things better. This fucking stone fucking knife thing, this spearhead sucks. We can get better. We can get metal. And there's like slowly but surely, there's this wherever that need or that drive comes from, always trying to make things better, always trying to make things better. But what does that mean? What's wrong with this so-called savage lifestyle, this lifestyle? And there were many people that romanticized this freedom of living on the plains and living off the land and not having even at the time, especially, they didn't have a god like, a lot of Europeans did at the time, right? So you look at it and it's like, again, under the lens of history and good and bad, you can't really look at it that way, Yes, they were killing each other. Yes, there was a lot of death and savagery and carnage. But if that's just part of your lifestyle of life, it's not necessarily something that we can make a judgment call on. It would be nice if we didn't kill each other, I guess. It's hard not to be like, hey, let's maybe not kill each other. But again, the life and death is so different in nature. And I think, we as human beings have, and with organized religion and just medical science and things like that have made it seem like, hey, we should stay alive as long as we can. We can do good things in life. Death, there could be an eternal afterlife, but you have to do good things in this life to make sure you get there. That's kind of like the religious bend. But again, we can live these longer lives now with medical science, and why not? Why not keep living? We obviously have this drive to perpetuate the species, and the longer you're alive, the more chances you have to perpetuate your DNA, which is, a very naturalistic, diminutive, deconstructive fucking viewpoint of it. But also, again, there's an innate drive in almost all humans to stay alive, and I think that should be honored in a way, and killing each other doesn't necessarily get us to that point. So I don't know. I think, yeah, if we can make any judgment, maybe like scalping and mutilating genitals and fucking cutting people and shit, and cutting yourself. Part of their like religious ritual was like cutting parts of yourself and bleeding and doing all these things. But again, it's hard to come into these places and say, hey, this is the way you should do it, and we're going to kill you if you don't do it our way. Guns, germs, and steel. I guess it comes down to that again, Anyway, folks, that was Empire of the Summer Moon. Check it out. Like I said, it's a little bit of a heavy read, but it's a really interesting encapsulation of kind of what really went down with a lot of these North American tribes, and how they are where they are today in some ways, right? So anyway, thank you so much for listening. Support the podcast. Check us out next time. I'll see you next Wednesday. Love y'all. Peace.